So back during the Middle Ages, there were thousands of Benedictine monasteries all over Europe. And the stories that have been passed down about how a young man would join one of these monasteries, basically he would have to walk for a few hundred kilometres to get to the monastery. And he would arrive at the walls that surround the monastery, and he would bang on the door, and a little opening would open, and a monk would say, "What do you want?" And he would say, "I want to become a monk." And the monk on the inside would say, "Go away, we don't want any more monks," and slam the door shut. And so he would bang again, and the monk would say, "What do you want?" He'd say, "I want to become a monk." He said, "I told you, go away." And so the young man would wait overnight, and the next morning, bang on the door again, and the same routine would continue. The monk on the inside would say, "We don't want you. We've got too many monks already." And sometimes the young man would be out there for 3 or 4 days, and finally a loaf of bread would be thrown through the hole in the door. And every day he would bang on the door saying, "I want to become a monk." Now this would go on for weeks, sometimes months, as the young man's just sleeping in the heat of the sun or in the rain or the snow. And eventually, one day he would bang on the door and say, "I want to become a monk." And the door would open up and they would say, "Come on in." Now, it was basically a test. It was a test because the realization of how extreme the lifestyle was, but also that once you walked through that door, you would never leave. You were there for the rest of your life inside the walls of the monastery. And so really they were trying to test the young man's motivation. Why are you really here? Now, I want to use that story as a way of interpreting this gospel, because the gospel we've just heard is quite possibly one of the most difficult passages in the Gospels to explain. On the surface, this makes Jesus sound like a really grumpy man, okay? Does not sound like a nice guy at all. But if we could try and explain the context, Jesus has just done a whole bunch of ministry. He's been working miracles, he's fed the 5,000, he's seen people who are desperate for healing, but they don't really want God. They want the miracles, but they don't want to change their lives. And he's got so many people just looking for some sign or wonder. It almost seems like he's a bit burnt out, because he has now gone to a foreign country, to a pagan country, and he's basically hiding. So this is from Matthew's Gospel. If you look at the version in Mark's Gospel, it actually says he went to a house and he made sure that no one knew where he was. He just needs a bit of time to himself to recover. And it's in that context that this woman now comes and starts banging on the door saying, "I want you to heal my daughter." And you can imagine Jesus just thinking, "I'm not interested. I came here to recover." But it seems to me that this is where he's actually testing her. He's had all of these Jewish people coming looking for miracles, but not really wanting to convert. And so he actually tests this woman out a bit. What's her motivation? What is she really looking for here? And this is where he pushes back a bit. He says, "I'm not working miracles here. I'm only working for the Jewish people." And she perseveres. And he pushes back again, saying, "Look, you're a pagan. It's not my problem." And she pushes back and says, "Look, we are seeking God as well." And at that point, he says, "Your faith is greater than anything I've seen back in Israel." And so he heals her. You see, this, I think, reveals to us something of what faith is actually about. You know, faith is something active. It's not simply an intellectual assent to some doctrine. It's the fact that I'm actually reaching out to God. You know, we saw this last Sunday where Peter steps out of the boat and he reaches out to the hand of Jesus. He doesn't just sit back in the boat and say, Lord, I believe in you. Now make the storm stop and get us home. It's an act of stepping out in faith. This woman shows the same thing, this boldness, where she's prepared to push God and say, I want God, and you have to give me the grace I'm seeking. Now, I think perhaps the problem is that we have been trained to be far too polite with God. You know, when we teach people to come into church, we teach them to be reverent, and that's a good thing. But maybe we teach people to be a little bit too passive. And we come in here and we think, well, I'm just going to wait for God to give me what I need. Whereas actually, the faith that God honors is a faith that goes out and seeks. A faith that really asks, a faith that keeps knocking until you get what you want. You know, when Jesus teaches us how to pray in Luke chapter 18, he tells the story of a widow who is seeking justice from a judge. And he tells the story that every day the woman would go and bang on the door of the judge's house, saying, give me the justice I need. And Jesus says, in the end, the judge will give her justice, not because she deserves it, but because he just wants to get some sleep. You know, he just wants to be left alone. But then Jesus says, that's how I want you to pray. He's saying, keep banging on the door of heaven until you get what you want. Now, I think this is kind of remarkable. You know, Jesus is playing a game with us where he wants us to wake up. He wants us to be active. He's testing your motivation. I think the reality is, you know, in the same way here in the gospel, it was a woman from a pagan country who had a greater faith than the people of Israel. The reality is that there are people who are outside the church who are seeking God with more passion than the people inside the church. And this is what should challenge us. We can come to church taking this whole thing for granted. I just presume I'm going to go to heaven, and so I don't really care about pursuing the mysteries of God. And yet there are people who have never heard of Jesus, who every day are wrestling with the mystery of God, trying to understand what is there. And I think the reality is that God would honor their hunger more than our lukewarm faith. You know, as Catholics, we teach that it is possible for non-Christians to get to heaven. We say very clearly that salvation comes through Jesus because he is the way, the truth, and the life. Okay, he is the way that has opened us the doorway to heaven. But we believe, very much based on this gospel, that the Spirit of God is working in the hearts of every person in the world. And God will judge people based on their pursuit of God. Now, we need to be very clear that that doesn't mean that everyone goes to heaven. I think the great error is that ever since the church started teaching this in the Second Vatican Council, we presumed, well, if non-Christians can go to heaven, that means everyone goes to heaven. But that's not actually what the church is saying. It's saying God will honor those who genuinely seek him. And the question is whether we are genuinely seeking him. If you go back to the writings of St. Augustine wrote this famous book called The City of God. And he was trying to present this idea that in every generation of history, there has been a people who have been responding to the grace of God and seeking him. And he basically said, this is what we would call the city of God. But he then makes this profound claim where he says there are people in the city of God who are not part of the church. And there are people who are part of the church who are not part of the city of God. And that should seriously challenge us. You know, there are people who are Catholic, who even go to church every Sunday, but they don't pray. There's no hunger, there's no passion. It's just something I do. It's a routine. We need to have the same hunger that this woman has. We need to have a faith that is alive and active, pursuing the mystery of God. And if we look at our hearts and see that our hearts are cold or just lukewarm, we've got to pray for the grace of the Holy Spirit. You know, there's a line in the book of Revelation, the first part of the book of Revelation, where God is speaking to the different churches. And he speaks to the church, I think it's to Laodicea. And he says, my problem with you is that you are neither hot or cold, you're lukewarm. And because you are lukewarm, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. It's a really confronting line. Basically what Jesus is saying is, I'm looking for people of passion. Either be passionately for me or passionately against me, but don't sit in the middle. So this is, I think, where we've got to pray that the Spirit could awaken our hearts, stir up again that fire of the Spirit in us, that we could seek the Lord with every ounce of energy in us.